Türkiye'nin ekonomi televizyonu Ekotürk'ten herkese merhaba. Ben Saida Zahidova ve bugünkü özel röportajımızda küresel ekonomiye derinden zarar veren ticaret savaşlarını konuşacağız. Özellikle ABD ve Çin arasında ticaret savaşları devam ederken şimdi de Trump yönetimi savaş cephesini özellikle Brexit süreciyle mücadele eden AB'ye doğru yönetmiş durumda. Ve bugün bizlere önemli araştırma kurumlarından biri olan Fitch araştırma analistlerinden Matt Sechovsky bizlere konuyu değerlendirecek. Hello Matt, how are you?
Hello, very good, thank you.
How does the USA announcement impact on US-EU relations and the Airbus-Boeing trade dispute?
So the US announcement to maintain tariffs marks actually broad continuity of the status quo. So for now, there are no major changes to the dispute. Now, some EU officials were hoping that the US would reduce tariffs to help with economic recovery after the coronavirus crisis, particularly after Airbus made some concessions which the US demanded in July. Airbus, for example, increased interest rate payments to France and Spain. Both sides say that but the EU still cautiously welcome the US decision, as it doesn't put any significant new tariffs on EU goods. The Airbus-Boeing dispute therefore remains in a kind of wait-and-see mode. This is because both the US and the EU await a crucial decision by the World Trade Organization, which is due in September, where the World Trade Organization will decide whether the European Union can impose retaliatory tariffs on the US, which is part of its lawsuit against Boeing, which is the other half of the Airbus-Boeing dispute. Now, the US seems to think that the EU has very high hopes about the ruling and that the final outcome will actually fall short of EU expectations in terms of the total size of the tariffs. Now, both sides say that they want to reduce tariffs in an international agreement, and they have been blaming each other for a lack of will to negotiate about this. That's essentially because there is a mismatch in expectations about the World Trade Organization and the announcement, which has entrenched different negotiating demands. For example, in the past, the US has said that they would like to include cars or agriculture in the final deal, which is a red line for the European Union. So disagreement as to the size of the EU's retaliation is essentially holding up progress, which means that talks will likely remain deadlocked until the World Trade Organization makes its ruling in September.
Okay, is there a risk that trade disputes, for example, over automotive imports, will be affected?
So other trade disputes are to some extent separate. So the Airbus-Boeing dispute is at least 16 years old, and both sides have largely remained within the boundaries of the World Trade Organization throughout this time. This is a difference to other disputes, like the automotives dispute, which has often featured in other domestic or foreign policy issues. Auto imports has largely gone quiet for now. President Trump has proven unwilling to impose a tariff on EU cars, allowed the so-called Section 232 investigations into EU cars to lapse without any action in November last year. We believe this is likely due to the significant economic damage which such a tariff would likely inflict on the US and EU economy combined, because they would likely trigger a retaliation from the European Union as well against the US auto tariff. And if the tariff went ahead, the trade worth around $80 billion per year would likely be affected, and supply chains globally would likely be impacted as well. And this could, of course, also have negative implications for Trump's domestic popularity. In the upcoming presidential elections, most swing states such as Iowa, Michigan, Ohio, or North Carolina, they employ a significant number of people in manufacturing, and Donald Trump needs to win in these states in the presidential election. And because these states would be disproportionately affected by the tariffs, he would probably, not want to impose those tariffs based on that. Now, since November 2019, when the investigation expired, President Trump continued to mention the auto tariff. A few times he threatened to implement it, for example, in January 2020 or in June 2020. But we believe this is part of his wider approach to foreign policy and politics more generally, and this does not actually signal a high threat of tariffs on European car manufacturers.
As long as I can see that these elections in November will have a huge effect on the global economy anyway. And what about the other EU-USA trade disputes like digital services tax, and could this be escalate?
Yeah, so these are probably the most dynamic disputes about the digital services tax, and of course this remains very much alive, and it's probably the most dynamic trade dispute between the USA and the EU right now. So the dispute started in 2019 when the US first imposed tariffs over the digital tax on France, where the US claimed that the tax discriminates against US companies. This has led to international negotiations because other countries, including Turkey, were also planning to implement their own digital services taxes at that time. These negotiations reached a deadlock in December 2019, and the US essentially said it would move ahead with the tariff on some French exports, but France managed to negotiate a delay to the tariff in exchange for a temporary suspension of the digital services tax until the end of 2020. But at the same time, other countries moved ahead with their digital tax plans, again, including Turkey or the UK or Spain, and these countries have subsequently also faced tariff threats from the US. Now, the negotiations failed to make any progress since January, and they were further delayed by the coronavirus pandemic. And the US itself ultimately withdrew from the talks in June this year. And as a result, we expect that many countries will implement it naturally. Some have already done so. And the EU could also revive its plans for an EU-wide digital services tax. The US is, of course, pushing back against this, and they have launched a new investigation into several other countries, as well as the EU, and this again includes Turkey and 8 other countries. And this suggests that tariffs over the issue are very possible, but most likely only after the US presidential election. And this is because, first of all, the international talks on the digital tax will only conclude towards the end of this year, which means that many countries will hold off on collecting on the tax until then. And this means that there will not be a clear trigger point for Trump to actually impose those tariffs until after the election. Now, the election itself matters somewhat because both Trump and Joe Biden, his main rival, they have a broadly similar approach to digital taxes. But Biden could show a bit of a more willingness to reach a compromise solution and revive the negotiation. And this could ultimately help us to avoid those tariffs. And there are, of course, other disputes as well, which are likely to emerge over the next few years.
It's just like a little question in between my other questions. Which president will have a good effect on the European economy, like Trump or the Biden?
So if President Biden, if Joe Biden wins the presidential election, we would expect a broad improvement in US-EU relations. We would expect investors to be more confident in the overall economy because Joe Biden is more aligned with the EU in terms of many trade policies. And also he has more of a win-win approach to trade as opposed to Donald Trump's sort of zero-sum approach. So in other words, Joe Biden sees that when there is good progress on international trade, both sides can win, whereas Donald Trump seems to have an approach where only one side can win. So that would definitely be good news for the global economy, we believe.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about. What about the race for the White House has begun, and the outcome of the 2020 U.S. election will have huge impact to the world for sure. What does the role the USA presidential election play in the dispute then?
So for the Airbus-Boeing itself, the election is actually quite interesting because it provides an incentive for US President Donald Trump to have some kind of deal with the EU, because he has been trying to promote himself as a kind of deal maker, as someone who can conclude trade deals with various countries while also promoting American interest. So it would actually be an incentive for him to try and make a deal with the EU on tariff reduction, but again, probably once the WTO announces the exact details of the EU retaliation in September. Another aspect of this is that, of course, it's quite possible the EU will be reluctant to make a deal so close to the election because arguably at least some EU officials would probably think that it is not in their interest for President Donald Trump to be re-elected. So there are a lot of political calculations going to this. Ultimately, much will depend on the size of the retaliation that the World Trade Organization will grant to the European Union. If it is too small, then we could see more demands from the US for additional concessions, or alternatively, the US could only agree to partially lift their own tariffs, so as to kind of make the deal more proportional, which would probably cause more delays and again sustain tariffs until early 2021. For the other dispute, another question is whether the election will actually lead to a change in the US Congress or the US Parliament, not just the presidency. Because again, the US Congress has a lot of powers in foreign policy, and if the Democrats win both the Congress and the presidency, this could ultimately help both sides reach a negotiating solution.
I see. Upcoming the USA elections will be a major theme for the financial market for 2020 and the next upcoming years, obviously. How will USA and EU trade relations change the election then?
So if Donald Trump is re-elected, then we expect further tensions and uncertainty in the next 4 years. The Airbus-Boeing dispute is perhaps the easiest one to be resolved, even under a Trump president, because it is fairly straightforward to negotiate once the final WTO ruling is made. But other disputes will remain unresolved or re-emerge. This includes the digital services, as we talked about, or perhaps the carbon adjustment mechanism, which is essentially an EU-wide tax on products with a large carbon footprint. Now, the European Union would like to have this mechanism in place by 2023. And if Donald Trump is re-elected, this will only add to the technical and political obstacles which the carbon adjustment mechanism has to overcome. We would most likely see new threats of tariffs in the coming years if this is the case. Similarly, during a second Trump term, the EU would remain under significant pressure to side with the US in US-China trade war. And again, this could, for example, include more pressure on the EU to ban Huawei from its digital infrastructure. Conversely, if Joe Biden is elected president, then we would expect relations to improve markedly. As I mentioned, Joe Biden is much more aligned with the EU on a range of policies, for example, climate change. He would like to rejoin the Paris Agreement, for example. He also has a much more moderate approach to trade. Again, as I mentioned, he has more of a win-win attitude as opposed to Trump's zero-sum approach. And this would make him more predictable on trade and tariffs, which would be good news for financial markets, of course. He would most likely put the idea of placing tariffs on EU autos to rest. And again, he would probably quite quickly reach a tariff reduction deal in the Airbus-Boeing dispute. At the same time, it is important to keep in mind that Biden as a president would be no panacea. He would not resolve everything. As I mentioned, on the digital tax services, he would probably still seek to minimize the tax burden facing US companies abroad, which might still lead to some disputes with the EU, but perhaps not an outright.
I see. How will wider US-EU relations evolve after the election then?
So Trump's re-election would send a signal that transatlantic relations, as we know them, have kind of entered a new normal, a new low, and that the EU essentially needs to become more independent as a geopolitical actor and less reliant on the US for various issues. Broadly, it would be a continuation of the past 4 years. We would see more volatility around tariff threats. We would see negative implications for investor sentiment. And we would just see more kind of EU hesitancy on the world stage. In contrast, Biden's election would have more complex implications. Overall, we probably see an improvement for 2 reasons. One, as I mentioned, because he would be more EU aligned on several policies, and 2, because where there would be disagreement, where they would disagree, he would still be more likely to reach a negotiated solution in a kind of calm fashion. We probably see less of diplomacy by Twitter. Does not mean that he would completely reverse back to pre-Trump times. In many ways, Biden presidency would be a continuation on substance, but a break from the form, from the Trump presidency. It would be a kind of continuation of America first by other means. For example, President Joe Biden would still expect Germany to spend more on defense, and he would still be very hesitant to sign very ambitious trade deals, and he would be wary of globalization. But he would not resort to the kind of inflammatory rhetoric that we are kind of used to from President Trump. And as I mentioned, he would again seek a more win-win approach to trade, which should ultimately benefit both the US and the EU. For example, he would likely pursue US interests by trying to enforce stronger labor and environmental standards, which again is something that the EU is trying to do more of as well.
I see. Could the USA and the EU cooperation, more on the other issues then?
Yes, so again, this will depend on who wins the election. Under President Trump, a second Trump presidency, we would likely see continuity of the current quite poor state of USA-EU relations, and the EU would likely feel that the US is an increasingly unreliable partner. In contrast, under Joe Biden, we would likely see greater EU operation on many geopolitical issues, where perhaps the Middle East stands out as the most significant change. Joe Biden has already said that he would seek to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal, JCPOA, and he would likely be much closer to the EU on the Palestinian territories, for example, where he openly opposes Israeli plans to annex parts of the West Bank. He also said that he would seek to renew or renegotiate several arms control treaties, including with Russia, which is again something that the EU would welcome in a break from Trump-era policies. But at the same time, some of his policy stances could prove quite controversial. He would likely be more hawkish on Russia, for example, which would be welcomed by some EU members, such as Poland or in the Baltics, but could prove awkward for some of the more Russia-friendly countries. And at the same time, we would also expect that Biden would like the EU to do more on defense. He would not be willing to intervene abroad as openly as had been the case in some of the previous US presidents. And this includes countries from Syria, Libya, or Iraq.
Yeah.
And similarly, with regards to Turkey, we have seen the recent video of Joe Biden from December 2019, where he criticizes President Erdogan. You can suggest that Turkey-US relations could become a bit colder under Biden. Again, much will depend on the result of the elections to the US Congress as well, which again has very significant foreign policy powers, including around sanctions.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Sechovsky. It was great to listen to you and hope to see you in another program.
Thank you as well. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Bugünkü özel röportajımızın sonuna geldik. Haftaya görüşmek dileğiyle. Hoşça kalın.